I was 25 years old, and though I considered myself healthy and disciplined, I had never been much of a drinker. My friends, however, were the opposite. They loved late-night gatherings, loud laughter, and the clinking of glasses that seemed to echo like a ritual of youth. On that particular night, I allowed myself to be convinced. "Come on, you're old enough now. One night of fun won't kill you," they teased, shoving a glass into my hand. At first, I resisted. My body had never liked alcohol much. Even a few sips in the past had left me dizzy. But under the neon glow of the bar lights and the constant cheer of my friends, I surrendered. The drinks went down faster than I expected, each swallow burning my throat yet leaving behind a strange warmth that made me forget how much I had consumed. The music thumped in the background. Laughter surrounded me, and for a while I let myself get carried away by the reckless energy of the night. But my body wasn't built for it. By the time we left, my legs felt heavy, my stomach uneasy. My friends waved me off casually, assuming I would manage. I stumbled home, somehow unlocking the door before collapsing onto my bed. The room spun in circles around me, and though I tried to sleep it off, the dizziness only grew worse. Hours must have passed. I don't remember the dreams, only the sudden jolt of waking with nausea clawing at my throat and a tightness in my chest. Sweat drenched my shirt. I staggered to the bathroom, splashed water on my face, but nothing helped. My pulse raced unnaturally fast, and a deep fear crept into me. This wasn't just a hangover. Something felt truly wrong. I sat on the edge of my bed, clutching my sides, fighting against waves of weakness that left me trembling. The clock ticked past midnight. I tried lying down again, but within minutes I felt worse, as if my insides were caving in. The thought of staying alone in that room terrified me. I needed help. Pulling on my shoes with unsteady hands, I stepped outside. The night air hit my face, cool, sharp, but strangely comforting. The streets were nearly empty, save for a few dim streetlights that cast long shadows. My breath came out ragged, each step heavier than the last. I wrapped my arms around myself, half from the chill, half from the ache spreading through my body. The world seemed quieter at that hour, the kind of silence that makes every sound echo. A dog barked in the distance, a window creaked shut, and somewhere far away I thought I heard the hum of a motorcycle. But otherwise it was just me and the echo of my footsteps as I forced myself forward. I knew there was a small medical clinic not too far from my house. I had passed it many times during the day, its plain sign blending into the neighborhood. Now that faint memory became my destination. Each block felt like an endless stretch of road. My head pounded with every heartbeat, my vision blurred at the edges, and more than once I thought I might collapse right there on the pavement. I kept telling myself, just a little further, just keep moving. The fear of not making it spurred me on. My mind wandered darkly. What if no one found me? What if I fainted in the middle of the road and never woke up? At 25, I wasn't ready for my life to end because of one foolish night with friends. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the glow of the clinic sign appeared ahead, faint but steady. I nearly stumbled running the last few steps, my chest heaving with relief as I reached the door. The building looked small, half asleep under the flickering light above the entrance. I hesitated for a moment, clutching the doorframe, my palms slick with sweat. Pushing the door open, I stepped inside. The sterile scent of medicine and disinfectant immediately hit me, mingling with the faint hum of an old ceiling fan. The waiting area was empty, silent, almost eerie in the dead of night. For a second I thought no one was there, then I saw him. Behind the counter, under the harsh white glow of a desk lamp, sat a man in a white coat. His head was bent over some papers, his dark hair slightly disheveled, but as soon as he heard the door creak, he looked up. His eyes locked on me instantly, sharp but not unkind, and in that moment all the fear I had carried with me began to ease. I stumbled forward, nearly tripping over my own feet. He rose quickly, pushing the chair back, and came toward me with calm urgency. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low but steady. The last of my strength gave way, and I leaned against the counter, my words barely forming. I don't feel good. Please help me." And just like that, I knew I was in the right place. The man in the white coat reached me before I collapsed, his arm sliding under mine with practiced steadiness. I felt the weight of his support as he guided me toward a narrow examination bed pushed against the wall. His movements were efficient, almost automatic, yet there was a quiet gentleness in the way he handled me, as if he knew I was fragile and didn't want to make it worse. "Sit down." Slowly, he instructed, and though my head spun, I obeyed. The cool paper crinkled beneath me as I lowered myself onto the bed, gripping its edges for balance. Up close, I noticed the lines etched into his face, faint, but carved deep enough to suggest years of long nights like this one. His eyes, though tired, had a depth to them, the kind that belonged to someone who had seen too much suffering but hadn't lost the will to care. He looked about 35, older than me, but not distant, his presence carrying the gravity of experience. "What did you take?" he asked, crouching slightly to meet my eye level. "Drinks," I murmured, ashamed. "Too many. I feel like my chest is tight. My head won't stop spinning." He nodded, not judgmental, only focused. "Okay, we'll take care of it. Just breathe for me." His hand pressed against my wrist, checking my pulse, while the other lifted a small flashlight to examine my pupils. The sudden brightness stung, but his voice remained calm. "A little fast, but nothing we can't handle." I heard the clink of bottles and the shuffle of drawers as he moved around the small room, gathering supplies. A faint metallic scent of antiseptic filled the air. He returned with a glass of water and a few tablets. Holding the glass out to me, he added quietly, "Small sips. Don't rush it." I obeyed again, swallowing the bitter medicine with a grimace. The water soothed my parched throat, though my stomach churned in protest. I set the glass down with shaking hands, but before it could slip, he steadied it with his own. His touch was firm yet careful, lingering only long enough to make sure I didn't drop it. For some reason, that simple gesture pierced through my discomfort. It wasn't just medical duty. It was care, deliberate and human. He pulled a chair closer and sat down beside me, a clipboard balanced on his knee. "Any allergies? Medical history I should know?" I shook my head, still clutching the edge of the bed. "No, I'm usually healthy. I wasn't thinking tonight." "Most people aren't when they drink," he replied, a hint of a weary smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "What matters is you came here instead of trying to push through it alone." "That's a smart choice." His words, simple as they were, carried weight. In the silence that followed, I listened to the soft hum of the ceiling fan and the faint scratching of his pen as he jotted notes. The world outside felt distant now, as though I had stepped into a bubble where only my breath and his quiet presence existed. He stood again, placing a cool hand against my forehead, then gently on my shoulder. "Lie back for a bit. Your body needs rest while the medicine does its job." The contact startled me at first, his palm broad, warm against my skin, but there was no intrusion in the touch. It was steadying, reassuring. I lay down, my head sinking into the thin pillow, and for the first time since the night had begun, I felt something close to safety. He checked my blood pressure, carefully wrapping the cuff around my arm. The rhythmic hiss of air and the soft click of the gauge filled the room, almost like a heartbeat. When he noted the reading, his tone softened. "You'll be all right. Just need fluids and time. Nothing permanent." Relief spread through me, mingling with exhaustion. My breathing evened out, and though my body still ached, the panic that had gripped me began to loosen. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice catching. He looked at me for a long moment, his tired eyes reflecting something unreadable. "It's my job," he said quietly, but I sensed he meant more than that. Minutes passed in a gentle rhythm. He brought me another glass of water, held it steady as I drank, and adjusted the small blanket at my side when he noticed me shivering. Each action seemed small, almost insignificant on its own, but together they built a sense of being cared for in a way I hadn't expected. Somewhere inside me, trust began to form, not from dramatic words or promises, but from the quiet persistence of his attention. As the medicine settled in, my head cleared a little. I watched him from the corner of my eye as he returned to his desk, scribbling notes, occasionally glancing at me to make sure I was all right. The lamp cast a warm halo around him, highlighting the curve of his shoulders, the slightly slouched posture of a man who had spent too many nights awake, but still refused to give less than his full effort. I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. Instead, I felt anchored, as though the storm raging inside me had found something solid to hold on to. The dizziness hadn't completely passed, but the fear had. And in its place, something unexpected stirred, a quiet gratitude, an awareness of his presence that went beyond mere professionalism. Lying there in the dim clinic, listening to the steady scratching of his pen and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, I let myself drift, not into unconsciousness, but into a fragile sense of peace I hadn't known I needed. I don't know how much time passed before he spoke again. The clinic was quiet except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan above us, I lay on the examination bed, my body a little calmer now, the medicine beginning to work through my system. My eyelids felt heavy, but I wasn't asleep. I could sense his presence at the desk, the occasional scratch of his pen, the subtle clearing of his throat. Then, out of nowhere, his voice cut through the silence, low and unhurried. "Nights like these are always the hardest," he said, almost as though he were talking to himself. I turned my head slightly toward him, not sure if I was supposed to answer. His gaze was still fixed on the papers in front of him, but his voice carried the weight of something deeper than idle conversation. He leaned back in his chair, eyes shifting toward the ceiling. "You know, my wife left me 2 years ago." The words fell heavy in the room as if he had been holding them back for a long time. She said she couldn't handle the long shifts, the exhaustion, the smell of disinfectant that followed me home. She wanted more than I could give. I swallowed, unsure how to respond. There was a rawness in his tone, a kind of hidden pain that didn't need pity, only space to exist. He chuckled softly, though the sound was hollow. "Since then, it's just been me. The clinic, the nights, the silence. Sometimes I forget what it's like to come home to someone waiting." His eyes flickered to me briefly, then away as if catching himself. I listened quietly, my chest tightening with something I couldn't quite name. Part of me wanted to comfort him, to say something kind, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I just watched him as he leaned forward again, elbows resting on his knees, fingers laced together. "You get used to it. The loneliness," he continued. "Or at least you tell yourself you do. But it never really leaves. The nights stretch out too long, the silence grows louder. And when someone walks in, even if it's just a patient, sometimes it feels like the world gave me company, if only for a while." His confession lingered in the air, filling the room with a weight I hadn't expected. I shifted slightly on the bed, trying to ease the ache in my back. That's when I felt it, something firm beneath me, pressing faintly against my side as I adjusted. I froze. For a moment, my mind raced. The atmosphere had grown so personal, so intimate in its own quiet way, that the sensation startled me. I tensed and glanced at him, my voice hesitant. What is that?" He looked at me, puzzled for a second, then gave a small laugh. "Oh, that? It's just my wallet. Don't worry." He patted his coat pocket casually as if to prove it, but my suspicion lingered. The way he had been speaking, the sadness in his voice, the subtle way his eyes sometimes lingered. It all swirled in my mind. A strange thought surfaced. What if he wasn't being entirely straightforward with me? What if his loneliness wasn't just about missing a wife, but about missing connection in another sense? I lay still, staring at the ceiling, my heart thudding faster than before. His hand brushed lightly against the edge of the bed as he adjusted his chair closer, and suddenly every movement felt magnified. My thoughts grew tangled. Was I imagining it? Or was there something in the way he looked at me, something that hinted at unspoken desires? He had cared for me with such attention, such tenderness, it had felt comforting, safe. But now, with the room dimly lit and his voice still echoing in my ears, I couldn't help but wonder, was there more to it than just professionalism? I caught myself studying him in return. The tired lines on his face, the strength in his hands, the way his posture carried both weariness and quiet determination. He was older, yes, but not unattractive. Vulnerability seemed to cling to him like a second skin, and something about it unsettled me. Confusion settled in my chest like a stone. I didn't know what to feel. Fear, curiosity, or something else entirely. A part of me wanted to dismiss the thought, to tell myself I was overthinking, that he was simply a kind man speaking openly to someone who happened to listen. But another part of me, quieter and more daring, whispered that maybe, just maybe, there was truth in my suspicion. I pulled the thin blanket a little closer, trying to shield myself from the uncertainty curling through my mind. My body was still weak, but my thoughts were restless, spiraling in directions I wasn't prepared for. He leaned back again, sighing softly, as though the act of sharing had both relieved and exhausted him. "Sorry," he said after a long pause. "I don't usually talk this much. Must be the late hour getting to me." I forced a small smile, though my heart still beat unevenly. "It's okay," I whispered. "I don't mind." And I meant it. I didn't mind. In fact, I realized I had been listening intently, more attuned to his every word than I had expected to be. But even as I reassured him, suspicion remained like a shadow at the back of my mind. Maybe he was just lonely. Maybe he just needed someone to hear him. Or maybe in his quiet confessions and subtle gestures there was something else. Something I couldn't yet name but couldn't ignore either. The clinic had grown even quieter, as though the walls themselves had absorbed his confession and settled into silence. I tried to focus on the steady hum of the ceiling fan, the tick of the clock, the faint smell of antiseptic still hanging in the air. Anything to distract me from the swirl of thoughts inside my head. But then in the stillness I felt it. A hand, warm and deliberate, resting lightly on my waist. My breath caught. The touch wasn't forceful, not rough, but it was unexpected. My body stiffened immediately. A jolt of awareness running through me. My mind screamed to shift away to create space, yet I froze instead, caught between instinct and uncertainty. He didn't say anything at first. The weight of his palm was steady, not pressing, simply there, as though testing a boundary without pushing too far. And then his voice broke the silence, calm yet strangely intimate. "Why don't you have much hair on your body?" The question landed like a stone dropped in water, rippling through every part of me. I turned my head slightly toward him, eyes wide, unsure if I had heard correctly. My throat tightened, words fumbling before they could form. Shock prickled through me. Was this medical curiosity? A casual observation? Or was it something else entirely? I couldn't tell. I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. My instinct was to laugh it off, to pretend it was nothing, but my lips stayed sealed. Instead, silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Inside me, conflict brewed. A part of me wanted to recoil, to pull the blanket tighter and create distance. Fear whispered that my earlier suspicion was right, that his loneliness wasn't as harmless as I had tried to believe. But alongside that fear came something I couldn't ignore. Intrigue. Why had he asked me that? Why had he touched me there in that quiet, deliberate way? There was no malice in his eyes when I glanced at him. Only curiosity and perhaps something more vulnerable, more hesitant. My chest rose and fell unevenly, the blanket rustling with each breath. I thought about the stories he had just shared, the hollow ache in his voice when he spoke about being left alone. Was this question a slip of loneliness spilling into the open, or was it something he had wanted to ask, to test, to see how I might react? The longer I stayed silent, the louder my thoughts became. If I confronted him, demanded to know his intentions, the fragile sense of safety I had begun to feel could shatter instantly. If I stayed quiet, I risked feeding the uncertainty, letting it hang unresolved between us, so I chose stillness. My body remained where it was, tense but unmoving, and I let the silence carry my answer. He didn't push further. His hand lingered for a moment longer, then withdrew, as if he had sensed my discomfort. The warmth faded from my waist, leaving behind a ghost of sensation that refused to leave my skin. I stared at the ceiling, my heart pounding. Fear and curiosity wrestled inside me, neither strong enough to overpower the other. I wanted to dismiss it all, to convince myself it had been nothing more than a tired man saying something strange at a late hour. But deep down, I knew I would carry the question with me, replaying it in my mind over and over. His chair creaked softly as he leaned back again, sighing as though the moment had passed. He didn't apologize, didn't explain, and that unsettled me even more. I closed my eyes, pretending to drift toward sleep, though every nerve in my body remained awake, alert, alive with questions I was too afraid to voice. And in that silence, caught between suspicion and sympathy, I realized I no longer knew what to feel about the man who had just saved me. The air in the clinic felt heavier after his question, and for a long moment I didn't know how to breathe. His hand still rested gently on my waist, not in a forceful way, but just enough to make me hyper-aware of it. My heart thudded as if I had just run miles, though I hadn't moved at all. Then he pulled back almost abruptly and let out a slow breath. "I'm sorry," he said, voice lower, almost hesitant. "I shouldn't have asked that. Loneliness makes people act in ways they normally wouldn't. Please don't misunderstand." His words tumbled out quickly, almost nervously, and for the first time, I saw a crack in the calm, professional shell he had worn since the moment I staggered through the clinic doors. The tiredness in his eyes wasn't just from late-night shifts. It was something deeper, a weight pressing on him every single day. I sat there, my body still weak from earlier, but my mind now sharper, trying to process. I wanted to be angry, to retreat back into suspicion, but something in his voice stopped me. He wasn't mocking me, nor was he trying to corner me. He was human. I looked away, staring at the white walls of the clinic, at the faint buzzing of the fluorescent light above us. For a while, neither of us spoke. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was more like the kind you fall into when words feel too fragile, too clumsy to carry what's in your heart. Finally, he broke it. "Would you like some tea? Or coffee, maybe? It'll help settle your stomach." I glanced back at him. He stood up a little stiff, as if still unsure if I wanted him near, and walked to a small counter tucked in the corner. There was an electric kettle, a couple of mugs, and some tea bags. Nothing fancy, just the kind of thing a man who lived more at work than at home might keep. "Tea's fine," I murmured, my voice softer than I expected. As the water boiled, he leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his face partly hidden in shadow. He didn't look at me, just stared at the rising steam. "You know," he said quietly, "sometimes I wonder if this is all my life will ever be. Patients coming and going, me patching them up, sending them back out into the world, while I stay here, always here." His honesty startled me more than his earlier touch had. There was no mask now, no pretense of strength. He was just a man, stripped bare by exhaustion and solitude. When he handed me the cup of tea, his hand shook slightly. I wrapped my fingers around the mug, letting the warmth seep into me, and took a cautious sip. The tea wasn't particularly good, slightly bitter, too strong, but in that moment it felt like the most comforting thing I'd ever tasted. "You're not alone tonight," I said before I could stop myself. The words slipped out, unpolished but true. His eyes lifted to mine. For a second I thought he might cry, but instead he gave a small smile. It wasn't the charming kind, nor the professional one. It was weary, raw, but real. "Thank you," he whispered. We talked then, not about suspicious touches or unspoken questions, but about life itself. He told me about his childhood in a small town, about how he always wanted to be a doctor but never made it through medical school, so he settled for becoming a paramedic instead. He said he used to feel like a failure, until he realized that sometimes being the one who shows up first, who keeps people alive until help arrives, is just as important as being the one who finishes the surgery. I listened, sipping my tea, my body slowly regaining strength. In return, I told him about my friends, about how I often said yes to things I didn't want to do, just to keep up with them. How I wasn't really a drinker, yet ended up almost collapsing because I couldn't refuse. He laughed softly at that, shaking his head. "At 25, you should be building memories, not regrets," he said. The way he said it didn't feel like judgment. It felt like advice from someone who had seen enough nights like mine to know where they could lead. Our conversation stretched on, moving like a river, sometimes quiet, sometimes lively. We talked about dreams we once had, about regrets we carried, and about the strange ways life seemed to corner us. The distance I had felt earlier, the suspicion gnawing at me, softened with each passing minute. At one point, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "You know what I miss the most? Just sitting with someone, talking, no pretense, no agenda. Just this." He gestured to the space between us, and for the first time that night I smiled. A genuine one, because despite everything, the sickness, the fear, the doubt, here I was, sharing a moment that felt unexpectedly human. When the clock on the wall ticked past 3, the clinic was silent except for our voices. I realized then that my earlier fear had turned into something else entirely. Not attraction, not exactly, but understanding. A connection that felt rare, fragile, and strangely precious. As I finished my tea, I looked at him and said, "I guess sometimes a bad night can still lead to something good." His eyes softened, and for the first time since we met, I felt like he believed it too. The clinic had grown so quiet that even the hum of the old fluorescent bulb above us felt like company. I was beginning to feel more grounded, the medicine working through me, the tea soothing the last of the nausea. My body had steadied, but my mind was still restless, caught between suspicion and something softer I couldn't yet name. He had gone quiet for a while, staring at the rim of his half-empty mug, his fingers tracing circles along the ceramic as if trying to gather courage. Then he looked at me again, his gaze steady but careful, as though he didn't want to startle me. "Why don't you do me a favor?" he asked gently this time. The same words that earlier had made my stomach clench now came out differently, wrapped in something tender, almost pleading. I tensed, instinctively bracing myself. But before I could even let my suspicion sharpen again, he gave a small, almost embarrassed laugh and shook his head. "Not what you're thinking," he said quickly. "I don't mean anything like that. I'd like it if you could be my friend, someone I could talk to every now and then, someone who reminds me I'm not completely invisible." The words settled over me like a soft blanket. I blinked, trying to process the simplicity of what he had asked. All this time my mind had been tangled with fear, with half-formed doubts about his intentions, but in the end, all he wanted was something I had taken for granted every day, a connection. My lips curved into the faintest smile. "You scared me for a second there," I admitted, setting my mug down on the table beside me. He laughed, really laughed, for the first time that night. It was a sound roughened by exhaustion but still warm, like sunlight breaking through clouds. "I know," he said. "I've been clumsy with words tonight. It's been so long since I shared space with someone like this." The tension that had been clinging to me like a second skin loosened. My shoulders dropped, my breathing eased, and suddenly the clinic didn't feel like a sterile waiting room anymore. It felt like a small island where two people had washed up, stranded but not alone. I nodded slowly. "Being friends doesn't sound so bad." His eyes brightened in a way I hadn't seen before. It was subtle, but it was there. The relief of a man who had been walking in darkness and finally saw a flicker of light ahead. "Thank you," he murmured. "You don't know how much that means." We stayed up talking after that. At first, the conversation tiptoed around safe topics. He asked me about my family, what they were like, what it was like being 25 and still figuring out the balance between independence and responsibility. I told him about my parents, who worried when I stayed out too late, about my siblings who sometimes treated me like I was still a child. "And yet here you are," he teased gently, "out drinking with friends, braving the night alone, and ending up in my clinic. Doesn't sound like a child to me," I chuckled. "It doesn't sound like a responsible adult either." That made him grin, the kind of grin that reached his eyes and softened his whole face. For a moment I wondered how often he had smiled like this before his marriage ended, and how rarely he must smile now. When the conversation shifted back to him, I listened more carefully than I thought I could. He spoke about his wife, not bitterly, but with the ache of someone still nursing old wounds. She had grown tired of his long hours, of nights spent waiting for him to come home. Eventually she had left, saying she wanted a life filled with laughter and family dinners, not empty nights and cold coffee. "I can't blame her," he admitted, his voice low, "but it doesn't make the emptiness any easier." There was a vulnerability in his words that pressed on me. He wasn't trying to make me feel sorry for him. He was simply letting me see the cracks in his armor, and oddly I didn't feel weighed down by it. I felt trusted. "I don't know much about marriage," I said softly, "but I do know what it's like to feel left behind, to feel like the world is moving on without you." He looked at me then, really looked, and nodded. "That's exactly it. The silence becomes louder than any noise." We kept talking, drifting between heavy truths and lighter things. He asked me what I wanted from life, and I admitted I didn't fully know yet. That sometimes I felt like I was just saying yes to whatever came my way, even when it didn't make me happy. He listened, not judging, only nodding, as though he understood exactly what I meant. When he spoke of his own dreams, they were surprisingly small. He wanted to own a little house with a garden where he could sit outside in the evenings. He wanted to cook for someone again, to laugh with someone across the table. Not grand ambitions, just the quiet joys that make life feel less lonely. Hearing that made me realize something. All along I had assumed his presence, his touch, his strange question earlier in the night had been about something physical. But now I understood. What he was truly aching for wasn't lust. It was warmth, companionship, the simple miracle of not having to face the night alone. Somewhere in the middle of our conversation, I caught myself laughing. Not politely, not nervously, but genuinely. It had been a long time since I'd laughed like that with a stranger, and it startled me to realize how easy it had become in his presence. He laughed too, and for a while we forgot the late hour, forgot the walls around us, forgot that only hours ago suspicion had kept us apart. By the time I checked the clock again, it was nearly dawn. My body no longer felt sick, my mind no longer felt clouded. Instead, I felt light, like something heavy had been lifted, not just from him but from me as well. As I stretched, he leaned back in his chair and gave me that same small, honest smile. "I don't know what tonight meant for you," he said quietly, "but for me, it reminded me I'm still human, that I can still connect." I held his gaze for a long moment before answering. It meant that for me too. And in that shared silence, I realized his favor had already been granted. I had become his friend, and in some strange way, he had become mine. When the first pale light of morning began seeping through the clinic's small window, I knew it was time to leave. My body felt steadier now, the weakness and nausea that had brought me here replaced by a strange calm I couldn't quite explain. Standing at the doorway, I turned back once more. He was there, leaning against the desk, a faint, tired smile on his face. "Take care of yourself," he said simply. I nodded. "I will, and thank you." The walk home felt different than the lonely, stumbling journey I had made the night before. The streets were no longer empty shadows. They were alive with the quiet stirrings of dawn. Birds began to call out from trees, shopkeepers lifted shutters, the world yawned awake. I inhaled deeply, feeling not just stronger in body, but strangely lighter in spirit. What had started as a night of weakness and suspicion had ended with something I hadn't expected, the quiet gift of being understood. All through that day, his words lingered in my mind. The way he had asked for nothing more than friendship, the way he had listened without judgment, the way he had laughed, genuinely, vulnerably. It had left an impression that wouldn't fade. So a few days later, I found myself walking back to the same clinic. This time I wasn't clutching my stomach or fighting dizziness. I was carrying a small box of sweets I'd picked up on the way, unsure if it was appropriate, but wanting to bring something nonetheless. When I stepped inside, he looked up from some paperwork, surprise flickering across his face before softening into something warmer. "You're back," he said, a little amazed. "Not as a patient this time," I replied with a grin, setting the box down. "I thought maybe as a friend." His laugh filled the room, lighter than before. He pulled up a chair and soon we were talking again. About small things at first, then bigger ones. About the weather. About the stubborn old fan above his desk, about the people he treated late at night. But then slowly about life again. About what it meant to keep going. To find small joys even when the larger picture felt fractured. I realized I looked forward to these visits more than I cared to admit. There was something grounding about sitting across from him, listening to his stories, sharing mine. The loneliness that had weighed on him seemed to lift little by little every time we spoke. And I too felt something inside me healing, something I hadn't even realized was bruised. We laughed often, sometimes about silly things like how I once tried cooking and nearly burned down my kitchen, or how he claimed he was terrible at making tea but still insisted I drink it. Other times our laughter came from shared realizations, that even though we were at different stages of life, we carried some of the same questions, the same uncertainties. There were moments, too, when silence fell between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people don't need to fill the air with words to feel connected. One evening, as I was about to leave, he walked me to the door. His hand brushed lightly against my arm, not lingering, not intentional, just a small accidental touch. And yet it stayed with me. A reminder of how closeness can exist in the simplest of gestures. I didn't dwell on it, but I didn't dismiss it either, because what mattered wasn't whether we were bound for something more than friendship. It was that, for now, we were exactly what we needed to be to each other. Over the days that followed, the visits became less about obligation and more about choice. Sometimes I would drop by with tea from a nearby shop. Sometimes he would set aside a chair for me as though he had been expecting me all along. And in those quiet exchanges, a new bond grew, not rushed, not forced, but gently, like dawn unfolding after a long night. Looking back, I realized that night of sickness had been more than a stumble through darkness. It had been the beginning of something unexpected, a reminder that sometimes care comes from the unlikeliest of places, and that even in moments of weakness we can find the kind of strength that doesn't just come from medicine, but from human connection. As I left the clinic one evening, the sun setting behind me, I caught myself smiling without reason. For the first time in a long while, life felt less lonely. Not just for him, but for me too. The days stretched into weeks and soon weeks into months. What had begun as a night of sickness and suspicion slowly transformed into something far greater, something neither of us had expected. I had walked into that clinic trembling with nausea, my body weak and my mind clouded with fear. But when I looked back on it now, I realized I had walked out with something else entirely, a bond that had begun in the quietest of ways and had since grown into one of the most important parts of my life. The clinic became a familiar place for me, no longer just a building tucked away on a dimly lit street, but a sanctuary where I felt seen. I stopped arriving as a patient long ago. I arrived as a friend, sometimes even as a student of life, learning from his words, his resilience, his vulnerability. He never became a grand figure in my life the way a teacher or a boss might. Instead, he became something gentler yet more powerful, a mentor-like presence who didn't try to shape me but allowed me to unfold. He listened to me when I doubted myself, laughed with me when I made mistakes, and reminded me that even broken people could carry warmth worth sharing. Often, I would find him sitting at his desk late into the night, papers scattered, glasses perched low on his nose. At first, he seemed like a man defined by routine, a life hemmed in by duty and loneliness. But as time passed, I noticed how his posture shifted whenever I arrived. The lines around his tired eyes softened, his voice grew livelier, and sometimes when we walked outside together after his shift, his stride was lighter, as if the weight he carried had loosened. For me, those visits were no longer about repaying kindness. They were about belonging. About finding someone who offered me a mirror, not of who I was on the outside, but of who I could become if I dared to be honest with myself. One evening, as we sat drinking tea in chipped mugs, he leaned back and said, "It's strange, isn't it? How someone can walk into your life when you least expect it. If you had told me months ago that a sick young man staggering through my door would become this," he gestured loosely between us, smiling. "I wouldn't have believed it," I chuckled. "Neither would I. I thought you were just another doctor who wanted to patch me up and send me away. But then you started talking and, well, here we are." His smile deepened, touched with gratitude. "You made the nights feel less endless. That's not something I can ever repay." I shook my head. "You don't need to repay me. You've given me just as much, more even. I think I learned more about life sitting in this clinic than anywhere else." It was true. Through his stories, through his loneliness laid bare, I had come to see the human side of resilience. That strength wasn't just about surviving, it was about admitting weakness, about reaching out even when rejection seemed inevitable. He had taught me that, not through lectures, but through the quiet way he lived, the quiet way he allowed me into his world. There were times, of course, when silence fell heavy between us, nights when his memories caught up with him and he grew distant, staring off into nothing. I didn't try to fill those moments with words. Instead, I sat with him, letting the silence breathe. And in time, he would look at me and the heaviness would lift, even if only slightly. Sometimes companionship didn't need conversation, it just needed presence. One afternoon, I brought him home-cooked food, clumsy as it was. He tasted it, raised his eyebrows, and said with mock seriousness, "You're lucky you're young. Otherwise, I'd tell you to stick to takeout forever." I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my drink. But later, as we ate together, I realized that this simple act, two people sharing food, was exactly what he had missed most. The act of sitting across from someone and knowing you weren't forgotten. As the months passed, our bond grew steadier. Not dramatic, not explosive, but steady, like a river carving its way quietly through stone. I no longer thought of him as just the paramedic who saved me one sick night. He was a companion, a confidant, a friend who reminded me that life's greatest lessons often arrive disguised as accidents. Sometimes, when I left the clinic after spending hours with him, I would walk home under the stars and think about how strange life was. How a night I had cursed, the night my body gave out, the night I thought I was at my weakest, had turned into the night that brought me strength I didn't know I needed. Because in caring for me, he had allowed me to see his own cracks. And in sharing his loneliness, he had taught me that healing doesn't always come from medicine or time. Sometimes it comes from connection. My health, of course, fully recovered. The weakness that had plagued me was gone, replaced by a new vitality. But the deeper healing wasn't physical. It was the way I learned to trust again, the way I realized that not everyone who reaches out carries ill intentions, that sometimes a hand extended toward you is not to take but to give. And as for him, his loneliness eased. Not erased, not forgotten, but softened. The sharp edges of abandonment dulled by laughter, by conversation, by the quiet knowledge that he was not invisible. that someone had chosen freely to sit with him, to listen, to stay. We never put labels on what we became. We didn't need to. What mattered was the bond itself, pure and steady. A companionship built not on expectation but on the simple, beautiful act of showing up for each other. One evening, as we closed up the clinic together, he turned to me and said, "You know, if there's one thing I've learned, it's that life is strange. You think you're at your weakest, and that's when someone walks in and changes everything." I smiled, realizing he had spoken the words I'd been carrying in my own heart. "Yeah," I said softly. "Sometimes one night is all it takes." We locked the clinic door, stepped into the cool night air, and walked side by side. No grand declarations, no dramatic endings, just two people moving forward, stronger because of what they had found in each other. And that was enough.